Chapter 5. Decision. From the date of Mary Louise's death, a very different Francis came into view. The change is slow but perceptible. It is a change of outlook and mentality. It is psychological rather than physical. There is nothing spectacular or sudden about it, for the spectacular and the sudden are the exception rather than the rule in the lives of the saints. In his well-known work, The Psychology of Saints, Henry Joly emphasizes this point, which is not always given the importance it deserves. In quotes, "We must not forget that in sanctity, as in all things else, there is gradual development," he says. It would be a mistake to think that the high water mark of sanctity is reached on the day the saint makes the sacrifices that are most painful to nature. End quote. Bearing this in mind, it is still true to say that his sister's death was a decisive factor in giving direction and purpose to his hitherto vague desires. It has been well called his aesthetic conversion, for it was the beginning of that complete turning towards an utter surrender to God that was later characteristic of his sanctity. In quotes, "After the death of his sister," observed his confessor, Father Bompiani, "Francis devoted more time to prayer and recollection." End quote. His vocation to religion becomes clearer and more definite, but again there is that curious, almost inexplicable reluctance to take effective steps to implement it. A probable reason for this was his father's unhelpful attitude. Whether or not Sante Pacenti had any suspicions regarding this new development is besides the point. Without actively opposing his son's plans, he could still exert considerable influence upon them. He had already suggested that Francis should wait at least a year to see if he would change his mind. In any event, his lifelong legal outlook asserted itself, and he counseled delay and postponement of any final decision. This was quite in character, for he was known to be reserved by nature and cautious in judgment. In all likelihood, weighing the evidence with a lawyer's care, he recognized the depressing effect of Mary Louise's death upon Francis. Time was a good healer, he thought. Given enough time, enough distraction, and no more would be heard of this idea of joining a religious order. Within 12 months, he hoped, all this vague notion about vocation would be forgotten. Sante Pacenti may even have wondered if more definite steps might be taken to ensure that it was forgotten. Circumstances seemed to favor such a plan. The Pacentis were on terms of close and intimate friendship with the family of Judge Penechetti. The houses were not far apart, and visits were frequently interchanged between the two families. They met at parties to go to the theater and to dances together. They were almost inseparable. The judge's youngest daughter had been Mary Louise's best friend, and her heart ached with pity when she saw the grief-stricken face of Francis. She formed a tender attachment for him, which did not escape Sante Sagacious' eyes. He hoped his son would not fail to appreciate the fact. It would be a most suitable match in every way, and a formal engagement would effectively squash any idea of entering religion. Thus, Sante Pacenti continued to hope that, from his point of view, all would end yet well. He speculated on the possibility of announcing the engagement publicly when Francis had finished college. But Francis was not blind either. He was well aware of the tender trap prepared for him, aware too that matters were rapidly coming to a climax. He afterwards declared that had he tarried a single day longer in the world, he might have set aside his vocation altogether. Furthermore, he was quite convinced that had he done so, the Lord would never have called him again. Matters could not be allowed to drift indefinitely. Francis must have felt like a rudderless ship cast to and fro by every idle current. His vocation had been weighing on his mind for months, and he was seriously worried about his future. More than a month before his sister's death, he had written for advice to his old professor, Father Tedincini, now changed from Spaletto to Rome. Unfortunately, this letter has not been preserved, but from the Jesuit's answer, we can gain some idea of its general tenor and purpose. Francis had evidently spoken frankly of his spiritual troubles, his lack of inner peace. How could he find the peace of Christ? Obviously, too, he must have made some reference to his vocation. What was he to do about it? How could he bring it to fruition? In reply, Francis received a long letter, a letter which is of such vital importance to his spiritual development that it must be quoted almost in full. 2 points call for special mention. It was the year following the definition of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. Father Tedincini took advantage of the fact to remind Francis to show special devotion to Mary Immaculate. "She is your mother," he wrote. "You belong to her. She can therefore do with you what she likes, and can put you on the right road that will lead you to heaven." At the very end, he gave Francis an electrifying slogan that must have jolted him out of his lethargy. "Become a saint!" It was the first time anyone had ever suggested that to him. Father Tedincini wrote as follows: Rome, May 17, 1855. My dear Francis, Pax Christi, may the peace of Jesus Christ be with you. With these words, I offer you the best greeting that can be exchanged between those who are truly devoted to one another in Christ. May that blessed peace then be always with you, a peace that the world cannot give, but one that comes from Jesus alone, a peace that springs from his grace, which is ever with you. It is a peace born of heavenly light, in which you may discern the vanity and deceit of the goods of this world, the infinite value of things eternal, the loving designs of providence over you, and the will of God which you seek. But you will not find this peace amidst the distractions and pleasures of this world, because it is a peace which the world cannot give. You will find it only in a retired, recollected, and devout life. You will find it in humility, in patience, in obedience, in prompt and willing submission to those who are in authority over you. This is the way in which you must seek the peace of Christ, and as a means to obtain it, consecrate your will to him. He delights in peace, and his voice is never heard by hearts which are not at peace. Remember that the project you have in mind is one which needs prayer and tears before Almighty God more than all else. Here is what you must do. As this is the triumphal year of Mary Immaculate, get a little picture showing this singular privilege. Fix it on the wall of your room, and 5 or 6 times a day, more often if you can manage it, kneel before her, and with great devotion place your whole soul in this matter of your vocation in her hands. Pray to her, lovingly implore her to guide and enlighten you, to preserve you from the deceits of the devil. Ask her continually to forgive your lack of fidelity. Remind her that she is your mother. Therefore, you are no longer your own, but you belong completely to her. She can therefore do with you what she likes and can put you on the right road that will lead you to heaven." End quote. At this point, Father Cecchi breaks off to give some practical advice to Francis. He warns him especially of his tendency to take things too lightly. This lack of mental discipline had apparently caused trouble in his studies, particularly in 2 subjects, philosophy and mathematics. He goes on to end a long letter with words of encouragement and exhortation. "My dear Francis, take courage. Keep always in the mind the thoughts of Jesus and Mary, the thought of the endless eternity which is coming closer to us every day. And don't let these thoughts be without fruit. Let them inspire you to overcome your petty faults and to suffer gladly whatever pain such a struggle necessarily involves. In time, by dint of repeated effort, aided by God's grace, you will overcome them all. Let them make you detest sin and avoid bad books and bad company with as much care as you would avoid the devil himself. Let them help you to despise all vanity of attire and idle conversation, to cast underfoot all human respect, all the follies and foibles of the world. May they inspire you also to meditate daily with great affection of heart upon the eternal truths, and to approach the sacraments very frequently. In a word, let them persuade you to hate the world and all its false maxims, all it looks for, all it seeks. Become a saint. Goodbye. Yours in Christ, Peter Tedeschi." It would be impossible to overestimate the importance of this letter in the spiritual development of Francis Possenti. In the first place, it was well timed, for it came at a crucial moment to give him much needed advice and encouragement. But more importantly, it sketched in broad outline the picture afterwards filled in by Francis in greater detail. Everything is there: humility and patience, prompt and willing obedience, devotion to Mary, meditation on the eternal truths, hatred for the world and its false maxims. He read and reread this letter until he had it almost off by heart. It offered a plan of action which he would later carry out in full. The peace of Christ was offered to him, and he must be prepared to pay the price. With Father Tedeschi far away in Rome, it was apparently difficult for Francis to find anyone else to whom he could turn for guidance. In this quandary, he suddenly thought of a possible adviser. Deep in the forest, on the slopes of Montelico, overlooking Spaletto, dwelt an old recluse, devoted to a solitary life of prayer and penance. Many had made a pilgrimage to the hermit of Cessi, as he was called, and had returned consoled and enlightened by his homely wisdom. Possibly Francis had already stumbled across his lonely dwelling on a hunting expedition and had exchanged a few words with him. He made up his mind to visit him again, to lay his difficulties before him. It was a long and tiring climb, over broken ground and through dense woods, but at length Francis stood before the hermit's cell. The old man came out to greet him, and for a moment Francis wondered whether he was doing the right thing. The hermit's appearance was not inviting. His hair and beard were shaggy and uncut, his clothing patched and threadbare, his body gaunt and emaciated, but the shrewd old eyes were encouraging and kindly. They must have made quite a picture as they sat there side by side, engrossed in conversation. On one side was the young man about town, the bright scholar, the brilliant and fashionable Francis Possenti. Beside him was the old man, possibly unlearned in bookish knowledge, lacking experience in the devious ways of the world, but skilled in the science of the saints. Patiently, the hermit listened impassively, whilst Francis poured out the whole story: his broken promises, his doubts and fears, his sister's death, his father's attitude, the Jesuit's advice. He ended on a question mark. What was he to do now? The old man's answer was simple. It was no solution to keep running away from his problem. He must learn to face his difficulties boldly and follow out his vocation without fear. He blessed the boy and promised to pray for him. Francis retained grateful memories of the hermit of Assisi. In the very first letter he wrote from the Passionist monastery, he enclosed a special message for the old man, asking his father, "Would you please give the enclosed to the hermit of Assisi?" His gratitude was lasting too. For 8 or 9 months later, he added a significant postscript to another letter. "How is the hermit of Assisi, whom I consulted about my vocation? Write to him and tell him that on account of his prayers, the Lord has been very good to me. And don't forget to tell him that I need his prayers still. I need them very badly." Possibly, the hermit had suggested to Francis the value of corporal penance. This would be a useful ascetic exercise and a wholesome corrective to his excessive fastidiousness in attire. All at once, Francis began to practice no small degree of austerity, and unknown to anyone, beneath the bravery of his fine clothes, he started to wear instruments of penance. One of these was a small leather belt, studded on the inner surface with sharp points of metal, which he wore closely clasped around his waist. It was found accidentally one day in his room by Henry, who promptly took it away and hid it. Meanwhile, the months were passing by, and despite his newly found fervor, Francis continued to display his indecision. The world which he had known for all his young life could not be easily abandoned. Santa Vicente began to depend more and more upon Francis, and gradually introduced him to the preliminaries of what he hoped would be his future career. With the departure of Michael for his medical studies, Francis found himself promoted to the position of secretary. In the evenings, he read aloud from the official Gazette, whilst his father made notes. Later, he commenced to deal with official correspondence and to write replies at Sante's dictation. Soon, his services were indispensable. Had Francis completely forgotten his request to be admitted to the Society of Jesus? Did he do nothing at all about his vocation? In all fairness, it must be admitted that he was beset with difficulties on all sides. His good friend, Father Tedeschi, was far away, and Francis had no one to plead his cause. Quietly observant of his apparent inconstancy, the Jesuits had seemingly come to the conclusion that Francis Possenti would not prove such an acquisition to society as they had first believed. At all events, they made no further move in the matter, feeling that if Francis really wished to be a Jesuit, he would have to show a more active interest in following up his vocation. It is true that Francis at length plucked up sufficient courage to take a preliminary step. The year's delay which his father had counseled was drawing towards a close, and Francis felt it was time to act. He applied to the college authorities for a certificate of good character and of proficiency in studies. The testimonial which he received was adequate, but by no means enthusiastic. It is worth quoting in full. In quotes, College of Spaletto. I, the undersigned, testify that Francis Possenti was a student of this Spaletto College of the Society of Jesus from the month of November 1850 until September 1854. He attended classes in high grammar, as also in humanities and rhetoric. He was diligent and attentive in his studies, and made appropriate progress in them. I further testify that for a year and a half, he then regularly attended classes in logic, metaphysics, and elementary mathematics. He frequented the sacraments, he attended the Marian sodality and Christian doctrine classes, and observed our college regulations. A. Rossi, Prefect of Studies, Spoleto, April 20th, 1856. While showing himself a dutiful and obedient son, Francis prudently concealed from his father the steps he was taking to safeguard his imperiled vocation. In blissful ignorance, Sante Possenti took the lead in suggesting more frequent visits to the theater, more frequent outings to parties and entertainments. Francis smilingly acquiesced, but neatly took countermeasures against his father's rather transparent plans. I know for a fact, said his brother Henry, that when they were at the theater, he often asked our father's permission to go to speak to a friend. Actually, he slipped out of the theater and went quickly to the neighboring cathedral to pay a visit. If the great doors of the cathedral were closed, Francis crouched in the shadows of the porch, kneeling on the cold flagstones and keeping a lonely tryst with the Madonna. It was a strange contrast between the two sides of his life. In its own way, it was symbolic, too, of the change that was close at hand. From the bright lights of the theater and the glamour of the stage, he passed into the darkness of the night and the shadow of the church. He dared not stay too long, lest his father should notice his prolonged absence and question his whereabouts. Quickly rising from his knees, he slipped back to the velvet comfort of a private box overlooking the stalls. As the curtain fell, he smiled and applauded with the rest, and rose to return home with his father at the end of the show. He was quietly happy, for he had spoken to his friend. Amongst the treasures of Spoleto Cathedral was an ancient picture of Our Blessed Lady, believed to be of Byzantine origin, popularly known as the Icon of Spoleto. During the iconoclast persecution, when so many priceless works of art had perished in an insane orgy of destruction, this icon had been almost miraculously preserved. Brought from Constantinople, the picture had been presented to the city by the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa in the year 1115. For more than 700 years, it had been the object of popular veneration. In time of public calamity, the people trustingly turned for help to Our Lady of Spaletto. It was believed that many miraculous favors had been obtained through her intercession under this title. When the cholera devastated the city, the townsfolk turned instinctively to their Heavenly Mother for protection. Many in anguished prayer went up to Mary from the stricken homes of Spaletto. Day and night the faithful flocked to the cathedral, seeking protection for their loved ones or praying for their dead. Before the holy icon, tapers and candles told their flickering tale of simple piety, and votive offerings of thanksgiving showed that those prayers had been heard. Now that the ravages of the disease had ceased, the citizens decided to hold a public demonstration of gratitude. The great feast of the Assumption of Our Blessed Lady is always a great church holiday in Italy. By this year, the special Thanksgiving procession was fixed for August 22nd, Octave Day of the Assumption. Preparations had to be made well in advance, for this was to be a big occasion. Arches of flowers spanned the streets, colorful fringed tapestries hung from the balconies, flags fluttered gaily in the breeze. Proud mothers hurried along, bringing white-clad children to walk in the procession. Leading citizens, hot and self-conscious in their best clothes, joined in staggering groups at the rear of the long columns. The climax of the function would come when the archbishop, sitting on the loggia of the cathedral, would bless the city before returning the venerable icon to its shrine. For some unknown reason, Francis was not taking part in the procession. In fact, on this eventful day, he was not his usual happy self. Perhaps his thoughts, prompted by the procession, were with his dear dead sister, first victim of the cholera. Perhaps he was worrying again about his vocation. Certainly, he was depressed. Somewhere along the processional route, he joined Michael amongst the spectators. He afterwards confessed that he was drawn more from curiosity than from any sentiment of devotion, rather an astonishing admission. As the icon drew nearer, the exuberant piety of the crowd broke all restraint. Excitedly, they waved a forest of scarves and handkerchiefs. Women and children knelt in the dusty streets and crossed themselves. Men gravely stood and bowed their bare heads. The solemn chant of the Ave Maria Stella was interrupted by the enthusiastic shouting of the crowd. "Evviva la Madonna!" they cried. "Evviva Maria!" It was long since Spaletto had seen such a day. The richly embroidered canopy swayed above the crowd as the icon, borne on high by Monsignor Arnoldi, Archbishop of Spoleto, was slowly carried past. Francis knelt devoutly and looked at the gentle countenance of the Mother of God. He fixed his eyes imploring upon the calm, impassive Byzantine face of the Madonna and breathed an unspoken prayer for her guidance and maternal help. His heart felt strangely moved, and for a moment time stood still, for in that very moment it seemed to him as if the eyes of the icon had looked on him with sympathy and compassion. Could he have been mistaken? Did the eyes really turn towards him? But there was no mistake, no room for mistake, about the voice that sounded clear and distinct within his soul. It was as distinct as if someone had shouted the message from the housetops. The message was clear and emphatic and personal. "Francis, what are you doing here? You are not meant for the world. Hasten to enter religion." His mind was a prey to conflicting emotions. Pushing his way blindly through the crowd, he burst into tears. They were healing tears, tears of sorrow for his past blindness, tears of gratitude to his Heavenly Mother, who had thus answered his prayer. She had confirmed the truth of his vocation by this interior voice. She had given him the added assurance that he was taken under her protection and that now all would be well. There was no need for him to say anything in reply. There are moments too deep for words. For Francis Possenti, this was such a moment, the moment of truth, the moment of decision. This unmistakable voice, he remembered it to the end of his life, had cleared away all doubts. It had swept his spirit free of the dust of weary months and thrown the clear light of truth into the recess of his soul. All hesitation was banished now. The issue was no longer in doubt. He knew now what he had to do.